All right, y'all, we live for those who are checking in. We're going to give about 5 minutes for people to actually check in with us, and then we're going to get into it. So give us about 5 minutes.
Yeah, tweet out the link. I'll make sure I put it up for us.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Hold on. No, actually, I didn't put this link in. I'll put the Google link. I mean, people gonna come into the chat. Let me delete that one. Let's see. There we go. All right, I got it. All right, got it. Live, here we go, here we go. So
All right.
For those of us who are here, thank you for being here. My name's Adam Thomason. I am an itinerant speaker with I Am Red Rev, and I also help oversee Collision Records. And we are talking progressed evangelicalism with a focus on gospel fluidity. We'll explain that and why Frederick Douglass is important to the evangelical narrative. And then we are going to give a refresher on progressed evangelicalism. BJ, talk to the people. Who are you?
Yeah, my name is BJ Thompson. I serve as the director of Build a Better Us. We serve couples and families. One of the other opportunities that I have to serve, I serve alongside the navigators at Morehouse College, and I'm just blessed to be here. Yeah, and I'm ready to refresh this idea of progressive evangelicalism. So
that's good. So a lot of people are hearing progressive evangelicalism for the first time. And essentially what we're talking about is progressing what we would call the evangelical narrative, teaching, discipleship, tenets of the faith, which would be inerrancy of Scripture, faith in God alone, Christ alone, movement by the power of the Holy Spirit, understanding how to flesh out what we believe God in our minds to be fleshed out in our hearts and in our actions. And what BJ and myself and others around the world are saying, that historically into the present, we felt this burden and this burden and unrest that the narrative in which we have learned was more sanitized and Eurocentric than it was a global inclusion of African Americans and other stories who had a robust and influential piece when it comes to evangelicalism and the narrative of Christ. What are your thoughts on that, BJ?
Yeah, no, I think for those who are tuning in, who are asking themselves, what's progressive evangelicalism? And I think essentially what we're saying is, we want to get back to what's called biblical orthodoxy. And that's taking what we call conservative theology, the idea of sin is embedded in all people, Christ alone, through grace alone, and faith alone, but help communicate a narrative that reflects real life in real time, and that's inclusive of all people, not just of Europeans, and not just of minorities. And so we just want to talk about God's narrative and hopefully make sense out of it, and give people some language. I think, Adam, one of the things that's been very clear is the last 2 years, given the death of even like a Michael Brown. Man, the church has been silent, and I think partly because we don't know what to do. We don't have any answers, nor do we know how to respond theologically beyond blaming individuals for it. So I'd love to just talk more about that and how we can create a robust understanding of theology while still focusing on issues that come up in these social arenas. So
That's good. Well, let's kind of kick it off. Let's just get into it. You know what I'm saying? Let's go to the abyss. I pray that people watching, you got your scuba gear on, because we gonna go deep fast. I was telling BJ before we came live, I said I've been knee deep in dissertation reading on everything. So I said, like, man, I'm on fire, bro. Like, I'm on fire. So check this out. When we talk about the gospel narrative, I want to point to people who have their letters, as they would say, in doctoral world. So if you want to research a guy named Nathan Hatch, and reading about George Whitefield, the Great Awakening, and its influence. The Great Awakening was in 1750, and its influence on the Declaration of Independence. Guys like Nathan Hatch, Caucasian guy, and I think it matters, so y'all don't think we're just talking about black people who look and see like us. Nathan Hatch had this to say. He said, when you look at the theological teachings of Whitefield, in 1750, and then the Declaration of Independence in 1776, we see that what Whitefield purported or what he preached was a precursor and a foundation that led to this kind of individualistic understanding that led, or that was a catalyst or an ingredient to what some would say is the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what Whitefield said, when people asked Whitefield during the Great Awakening about slavery, his response to that was, our goal, our directive is to get the African saved, but socially, they will be equal to the white man in heaven. And he used the words, the millennial church in heaven. Talk to me about that, BJ, because we see that's 1750.
Yeah.
Declaration of Independence is 1776. So we setting the foundation, not only theologically, but guys like Nathan Hatch are saying, that set the theological and political foundation going forward. You see that?
Yeah. So, I think about, just for example, traditions set by family. And, I think about, the traditions of, certain type of side being made at Thanksgiving, right? Every year my aunt would make what was called pistachio.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it's called. It was like a pie, right?
Okay.
And I was able to experience, her making this every year. But what I didn't recognize that it was rooted in a tradition. I think oftentimes, Adam, the things that you and I do, we believe ourselves to be so independent from history that we don't recognize that the things that we do are in right direct connection to the things that have happened in the past and the things that have been echoed to the past. And so one thing I think that's interesting as we talk about progressive evangelicalism, having a conservative view that doesn't avoid social issues, I think what's really interesting about the idea of that is we're not really familiar with the past. And oftentimes, even as we talked about this, and you and I have spoken about this before, even as we talk about the people of our past, especially people who we highlight them as heroes.
Right.
And we talk about the amazing contributions that they've made. Well, if you're a parent like I am, and you're flawed like I am, you know that no matter how hard, no matter how diligent you are, you're going to do some things that bring about some negative wounds into the life of your child,
That's good.
right?
That's
And
good.
so, what I would say, part of the historical reasoning for progressive evangelicalism, George Whitefield, if many of you don't know, is considered the father of evangelicalism. You look at his sermons, you look at his revivings, the Great Awakening. If you know nothing about church history, especially American church history, he is considered that. But when you look at some of the policies and how he negated the imago Dei, the image of God reflected in people of different skin tone, you see this gross error that carries with it substantial implications. Okay, so let me tell you what I mean by that. There is one thing to have errors that have some implications. There's another thing to have errors that have substantial implications.
Right.
And I think that when you look at what George Whitefield did in 1749, just reading this again, it says that 1735, slavery had been outlawed in Georgia, the state of Georgia. In 1749, George Whitefield campaigned for the legalization of slavery.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So again,
so some of y'all, let's kind of give them insight into that so they can understand why that matters. So 1619, the first slaves, according to most historians, they use 1619 or 1620, came on the Dutch man of war to the Virginia port. Okay, that's 1619.
Yeah.
We're still under British colonial rule. So these 13 colonies, if you do your research, they're under British colonial rule. Why does that matter? Because as the Americas, so to speak, from a Eurocentric standpoint, is being established, what comes with that is the Puritan theological preaching, the Puritan work ethic that turns into the political work ethic that turns into what we would say is to pull yourself up by your bootstraps in the American dream. So we see guys like Cotton Mather and people like that before even a Whitefield established in theology this political mantra and work ethic. So when BJ says it's outlaws in 1739 and then it's reinstated, what Whitefield had to do was come from London to the New Americas, and then he had to write back to British to get it reinstated. All the while, now y'all need to understand this, all the while he's preaching revivals, right? Yeah. So why that matters is because right there, if he's the father, if he's dad of evangelicalism, right there, he's just separated that the gospel is about proclamation and not social implications, right? Just right there. Just right there.
Just like that. Just like that. Well, I mean, you know, that's hard because I think a lot of us have so absorbed the idea that those two were separate that we co-sign the fact that they're supposed to be. You know, one thing that I've recognized in my recent years, the idea of being considered a liberal has a negative connotation, and it coincides with this social gospel. And so what we see just with George and just kind of talking about some of the issues and why we need progressive evangelicalism is that there's a duality that exists within the foundation of how we believe and how we express our faith that needs to be reconsidered simply for this reason. Though George Whitefield, I was reading an article about this, and you can Google it if you want, and it talks about him. He said he treated his slaves kindly, right? Now, in his mind, Adam, it's interesting to me that he justified the action by saying, man, we're going to give people loss of wages. We're going to breed them like animals, and we're going to cause them to fornicate. We're going to have them indebted based off of the color of their skin. They're not indentured servants, but we have to do this for the sake of economic gain. And so what he saw as innocent was absolutely damaging for the individuals who are experiencing it. I'll give you one example. A couple of years ago, there was a guy named Ariel Castro, and he locked up some young ladies in his basement. It was a horrific story. He enslaved them, chained them up, But it said that he has a great love relationship with a couple of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if Ariel looked at his relationships and he says, some of these women are happy. We have happy days. We're not always in bad spirits.
Mm-hmm.
We have happy days. We have great days. The problem is that's not the treatment that you give another human being, especially not being a minister of the gospel. And so I think that split actually has opened up the door for you and I to ignore issues of social concern based off of the idea that the gospel only entails theological proclamations.
Come on, man. Run that back, bro.
Yeah, that is. And I will run it back. I think that the reason why it's important for you and I to hear this is it's allowed us to have theological proclamations while ignoring real social concerns.
That's good. That is good. That is it right there.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is we need to progress to look back at saying the Father, what a great heart. Maybe he's caught up in the times. Let's call him a Nicodemus of his day, not a Caiaphas. It still laid some foundations that BJ is saying. That isn't the intent of the gospel, to separate the theological understanding from its social ramification. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, you got any other thoughts?
No, I mean, I think you look at Jesus. And I mean, if you want to ask the question, because he had a very similar issue of his day.
Yeah.
The Pharisees, when you look at Malachi, after Malachi, the era of silence, people talk about this. You talk about the Maccabees, and you talk about other individuals between that period. And God raised up what was called the sect of preachers called the Pharisees. And they were to be conservative, given what they saw happen to Israel by not obeying. So what you see, this is a scenario. If you turn to Mark 3, and Jesus does something really profound. It says in Mark 3:1, again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether or not he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked at them, and verse 5 says this, and he looked at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand, right? See, what happened in this is very similar to what's happening now in our nation, is they begin to separate proclamation and actual social engagement, so much so that when Jesus began to heal on the Sabbath day, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So much so that when Jesus began to heal on the Sabbath day, they disapproved because they believed that was a social gospel, not consistent with the scope of theology. And so I think what you see in Jesus is that he's grieved at that. He didn't celebrate that. He didn't even deny that he was God and could do it. He continued to do it despite their disapproval.
That's good. That's good. That's a great word. And just as part of a reference, if any of y'all wanted to check on the Nathan Hatch, I was reading the book called The Democratization of American Christianity. And in that book, he's essentially saying that when you look at a Whitefield, as BJ stated earlier, father of what some people say is the father of evangelicalism, he's saying that what Whitefield preached, taught, right, laid the foundation, not only theologically, but socially, of what others would then enact and flesh out. And guys like that we may not be able to get to are guys like Charles Colcock Jones, who was 100 years later predecessor. He had an angst that slavery wasn't right. But as Whitefield being his spiritual father, so to speak, he also focused more on the spiritual education of the Negro and not the social deconstruction of slavery, right? So again, that's Nathan Hatch. He has a PhD. He's the current president of Wake Forest University, and he wrote a book called The Democratization of American Christianity. Let's kind of go forward and talk about my dude Frederick Douglass.
Yeah. Come on,
Fred, my dude Fred. You know what I'm saying? And let's kind of I want to tell people and talk back and forth about why Fred, is so important. So again, just to give you dates, Whitefield and the Great Awakening, 1750. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Frederick Douglass is born under what we would call this thought of separating the theological thought from its social implications, and saying that the gospel essentially is what you say and what you believe, void of the social implications. So he's born in, guess what, 1818, right? So he's born after this thought is being marinated in. Now let's kind of read this thought and talk back and forth. Narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. He says this on page 72, right here, if you got this version, page 72. He says this. He said, I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, and a sanctifier of the most hateful frauds. Now watch this. He said, in a dark shelter under which the darkest, vilest, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slaveholders find strongest protection. He's saying this is under the religion of the South. And he says, and where I be again reduced to the chains of slavery, next to that enslavement, I should regard being a slave of a religious master the greatest calamity that could befall me. Wow. For all slaveholders with whom I've ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. And he's saying this after those who are of like Methodist. One guy was Mr. Covey, who claimed who was a Methodist minister, a Sunday school teacher, pious, had his own church. And guess who would be considered the father of Methodist in Stateside? Let's just guess from what we've been talking about. George Whitefield.
West. Oh, yeah. You have to establish all those different things.
I'm just saying, man.
Yeah, you know, man, it's hard because they didn't see it. Yeah. And I think for those of us who are watching, man, they didn't see it, and it was right in their face. And when you look at even the reflections of Frederick Douglass, who actually comes to faith and challenges the idea that it's not okay to enslave another human being generationally based off the color of their skin, they missed it because of a lot of the presumptions, or even absorbing the idea that the gospel could be separate from social implications. And so what I find is, even in 1 John, you read the Bible, you read what 1 John says. It says, how can you say you love God and not love your brother, right? Who you have seen, you have not seen. And so, Adam, in a lot of ways, we don't see that balance expressed in some of our heroes, but we perpetuate their theological implications in our everyday living. And I think one of the things is very intentional about the way that the United States was set up. The United States was set up in a way where we live in separate communities, and we find ourselves on opposite ends of towns, more so, or it's obvious in the fact that many people would say, well, I just grew up around all whatever, Caucasian, African Americans, Asian, or whatnot. And so then we start talking about issues of race, we start talking about issues of slavery, we start talking about social change. Many of us don't feel responsible. And so I think it's difficult because they lived in an arena where they found a way to justify those things. And you and I practice those things today. But when you look at what Jesus says, even in a Mark 3, he says he was grieved by what he saw. He was not excited. He was not okay. He could have stopped healing those people on the Sabbath just to appease them. But he knew that men were more worthy of life than those individuals. Let me read one other thing in Matthew 23. And I think it's really important that we see what Jesus is saying. He said this, Matthew 23, verses 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe, mint, and dill, come and have neglected have neglected the weightier matters of law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, right? Mm-hmm. So progressive evangelicalism looks like this, that if God is saying there is no separation between what you say and what you do, those two coincide one another. Those, if you're going to affirm the imago Dei, the image of God bearing in people, then you have to practice those things, and not practice those things from a distance,
Yeah.
as many of us love to do and love to claim to not have any racial animosity. We don't have any racial relationships.
That's good.
Right? But what Jesus says, if you're really going to practice righteousness, he says this. He says, you want to tithe, you want to deal in men, but you've neglected the weightier matters of law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness.
Yeah.
And so what you see in the scriptures is that Jesus is saying the weight of who we are is how the law system. And so let me give you case in point. Eric Garner being choked out on live television. For many of us, we checked out in apathy. We assume that he must have been a threat, even though we saw the video of what occurred. And that should grieve us, that a man was murdered over a pack of cigarettes. It should grieve us. He said the weightier matter of those things. And so the more we separate those things, the more we're unable to see the weight of what they're supposed to be in everyday living.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good word. And I believe what the scriptures that you read and that you so eloquently, exegeted towards us, I believe that was at the soul of Frederick Douglass, and I'm going to tell you why. Because, again, in his writings, he's saying, under my time, the worst slaveholders were those who profess to be Christian. So now, if we're going on the nature versus nurture argument, then technically, if we believe in nurture,
yeah,
he was nurtured, right, with those who were slave owners with the Bible. He was nurtured in the sense to believe, like, not only one was this his position to be property whipped, mistreated, but two, all the while with the Bible, and he had every in the nurture sense, every right to reject that. But let me read the power of God and why I feel like this is a figure when we talk about God's grace and his sovereignty. When we talk about him working all things together for the good for those who are called to love according to his purpose. When we're talking about how he set and purposed us and adopted us before the foundations of the earth that we see in Ephesians.
Yeah.
This is what Frederick Douglass writes. Now, some of y'all may not get to the back of this book. It's called the appendix. But he writes this piece. He says, what I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land. So he said, I'm not rejecting Christianity. I'm rejecting the false version of it. And he said, and with no possible preference to Christianity proper. So you would ask the question, what is he going to say Christianity proper is? He's going to say, for between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. Now, this thing is powerful. I'm going to read two more sentences and then I want to get into it. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other.
Wow.
I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. This is what you were saying in 1 John. Have love for your brother. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Now, there's more to it, right? And we could just read that. But going back to what you said on how 1 John, if you truly say you love God and you don't love your brother, how can you say the love of God is in you? This man wrote a piece after coming through all that degradation, hurt, mistreatment, and the power of God still comes through him to write that piece and love Jesus. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? What would you say to the people in light of that?
Well, so here's what I would say. I think that a lot of times, many of us, even as you reference the past, can't see the present. And so I believe that it's extremely difficult. People oftentimes assume that was just the past. And I think what you and I are saying in a lot of ways is that we're referencing the past as a gross error to the present day injustices of our time to say, when we check out of issues under the banner of that's social issues, and I'm preaching the gospel,
Yeah.
we miss the beauty of God's work of trying to change us to be involved in the pain of this world, right? And so honestly, when I look at it, and even some of the silence of our brothers and sisters in whatever regard, I recognize that it's a gross error, and you and I miss out on the beauty of what's called sanctification. That's when we participate in his work,
Yeah.
and we have to endure the pain. Jesus said, any man is going to follow me has to take up his cross, right? We do the uncomfortable thing of entering into something that
Right.
may not have originally been ours. And so I think one of the confusions for us, and I guess I'll let you talk us into it, how do we even connect that to present day without scapegoating and deflecting and saying that was just the past?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what he did, but that's not necessarily what I'm doing in my particular context.
That's good. That's good. I think that's a great question. And what I tell people who ask that question, I want to delineate that looking at the past has less to do with blame, has less to do with, hey, it's your fault and we want to be right. And it has most to do with, hey, let's look at why we're divided. Because the most understanding thing that we need to understand is that John 17, right? Christ said, I do not pray that you take them out of the world, but you leave them in there, protect them from the evil one. He says, I pray that they would be one. And right now, as a people, we are split along the lines of, let's just say, a theological understanding of the gospel and a social implication of the gospel, which leads us to the title. So when we talk about gospel fluidity, it's the simple illustration of water. Water in its purest form, liquid form, when you pour it into any form, right? If it's on the floor, it's flat. If it's in a cup, it's going to take that form. You put it in a balloon, it's going to take that form. It's fluided for the purpose that it needs to serve. So now when we talk about the gospel, it's not just simply in the form of proclamation and in the form of social implications. It is, right? It just is. That's what Jesus said of himself. I am what I am. He says, before David was, I am. That's what he was referencing that in Moses. And what that simply means is the gospel takes the form without rejecting the Godhead, without rejecting inerrancy, all these tenets that we hold to. The gospel takes the form needed in the moment to most communicate and push people to the Father. And we may communicate just simply something audible, but Christ incarnated himself. He didn't speak from heaven alone. He incarnated himself.
Come on.
And when he came, did he speak? Yes, he did. But did he touch and heal? Yes, he did. Did he do social things? Yes, he did. But did he preach? Yes, he did. It's the fluidity.
Yeah.
And that's where the Holy Spirit comes in.
Yeah.
Right? And what we have done now is that we've tried to, here we go with the continue on the illustration. Hey, it's not me, it's the Holy Spirit. We've made the gospel. We made the gospel one form.
Yeah,
right?
ice.
Yeah,
ice.
You already knew what I was
Gospel the frozen chosen.
You already
The
know.
gospel is the frozen chosen. That's all it is. It's ice. You're not get nothing else. It's the purest form of ice you can ever get. Listen, man. You know, again, I've been in circles. I've been around, and we have reduced the work of God to teaching and talking, and not to engagement of culture. And we use the word secular as if God, there's a quote that says there's not one square inch of the universe that Jesus doesn't say mine.
Yeah.
Every square inch of your life, Jesus says mine to. Every square inch of culture, Jesus says mine to. Yeah. And he wants us to be a part of that. Adam, talk to me about the practical applications. A lot of people are impressed. They hear theological argument as to why they should have some form of concern. Again, I think what I see is people checking out, and they justify checking out from social issues, especially when they're in their face, similar to the story of the Good Samaritan. Yeah. They see those issues and they check out. They go, oh, I'm out. I got to get to the temple. I got to get to where I'm going.
I gotta go pray for you at the temple.
Yeah, I got to go preach, right? So talk to me about the practical application of people who feel, I sent you, something earlier, like they don't know. They feel like they're so disconnected because of our social construct that they don't know how to even begin to engage with the gospel in that way. So talk to me about some practical ways we can get this thing rolling.
Yeah, I think one, so I got two. I think one, you have to understand, to piggyback, because you asked a question earlier that I didn't answer. History is about understanding the legacy that we're caught up in. It's not about pointing and saying who's wrong or right, but we have to understand that believer and non-believer, we all come in the flow of a legacy, and we're all going to hand down the legacy. And we look at the scriptures and say, okay, Lord, what legacy should we be embracing and perpetuating forward?
Yeah.
And so it helps us to understand the history, to know what we're caught up in, right? Is this right? Is this orthodox? Is this of Jesus? Yeah. And not saying, hey, just because he's a hero, I take it at face value. And so we got to have the courage to do that. Jesus had the courage to do it. His disciples had.
That's a good word.
Right? You see what I'm saying? The 72, the 500, the 120 upper room, they had the courage to ask the question, is this of the kingdom? And now getting to the current question. I think the second thing, when you have to have the courage to question history for a kingdom advancement, the second thing you have to do is ask, what is before me? And what I simply mean by that is, when you talked about justice earlier out of Matthew 23, ignoring the weightier issues, and you talk about that word justice, a lot of us see justice as a real situation, but I don't have the time to get into it. If you see someone outside your window being beat in the face with the butt of a gun, we see justice.
Good word. That's
calling 911, right? That's justice. I called 911. I did my duty. Yeah. But the biblical understanding of justice is not that. The biblical understanding of justice is you take upon that burden, you get into harm's way, even if it costs you your life. So now, going back to what we first talked about, when we talked about justice in Jesus Christ, you said, so good, though the justice system of the day got it wrong, Jesus kept entrusting himself to the one who judges justly, because he said making it right in the economy of God means I have to die.
Woo!
You see what I'm saying? Right? So when we talk,
I don't know, man. See, you talking that. See, now you getting into that radical.
Bruh.
That
Jesus living, my dude.
Is it really that serious, man? I mean, our audience is asking, is it that serious? Is it that? How do I know what to get involved in? There is the sex trade, there's sex trafficking. There is, Syrian refugees. There are, these Black Lives Matter people. I mean, when I say there is an array, man, how do we know where to get involved, Adam? We can't be involved in everything. What does that mean? Where should we put our focus and our energy?
Yeah. So like I tell people, I say, one, you got an immediate you should have an immediate community just out of health. And that's the circle of friends. I have that, BJ has that. And they affirm and say, hey, just from being around you, we see these are your gifts and your passions. Then from that comes a local assembly, and from the local assembly, they affirm as well. But also in community, put certain things before you, and your heart resonates for the kingdom to latch on to that. And two, again, on that point of justice is shouldering the burden and make it right.
Yeah. It's
what does the Lord bring across your path? I remember in 2008 when we were doing those conferences, Red Revolution in Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah.
The reason before it was Vogue and everybody started all these nonprofits to stop the sex trade, the reason my heart screamed to get involved to stop the sex trade was because a girl by the name of Megan wrote a paper on the sex trade in Cambodia. And I remember reading this, and I had a daughter at this time. I go, wow, like if my daughter was taken and is in the sex trade, I would want an Adam in America to at least care enough to do something about it.
Wow.
And the Lord just brought that across my path.
Wow.
You see what I'm saying? So sometimes we just got to see whatever the Lord brings across our path. It could be a tweet. It could be a blog. It could be a website. We have to say yes to saying, I'm willing to shoulder that burden.
Yeah.
Right? To the extent that it may cost you your life like Jesus. I was looking at this video earlier, Bill Mayer, right? He's a staunch against Christianity.
Yeah.
He's cracking all the jokes. But if you look at what he's saying, he's just saying if what Christians say they follow of Jesus, who said, love your enemy.
Yeah.
If that's true, he concludes that, well, most of the ones that I see, they don't love their enemy and they really don't follow Jesus. They just entertain him.
That's a good, that's a good word. I mean, I don't think we see when we've actually strayed because a lot of times, Adam, we think that we've strayed because we've strayed in teaching. We don't see straying as straying in the practice of those truths in the face of culture, right? And so one of the things that I would say is the believer can't keep closing their eyes. One of the things that's really grievous at this point in my life is when I realize that leaders and Christians don't know what's happening in world events, nor do they care. And nor do they believe they should, because they believe that is a secular understanding. And when we recognize that God loves people, and God loves people in different arenas of life, and that God wants those people to have life and life more abundantly, not just in heaven, but on earth. And when you hear about certain crisis, instead of checking out if that be Syrian refugees escaping the Arab Spring, whether it be Joseph Kony and what's taking place in Africa, Northern Africa, whether that be Black lives and what's happening in the United States, or whether it be North Korea and what's happening under the regime that they live under, you recognize that that is your call, that should be your concern. And to the degree that God has given you resources, relationships, connections, then you're called to respond. And so I think what's hard about it is we don't believe that is our issue. And we've justified it by saying it's not an issue. And there is devastating impact. George Whitefield, and just to bring it back to him, had an opportunity to not just not reinstate the enslavement of people based off of the color of their skin. George Whitefield had an opportunity to be faithful in the face of an oppression that did not respond to the scriptures that he was reading about the dignity of humanity, how we don't cause people to fornicate, which was a regular practice, how we honor our brothers and we create a community of brothers. And then one thing he said that struck me strange is he said he reinstated what he did because of money. Well, the Bible already says you can't do what? Love God and money. You can only love one. You're either going to love one and hate the other. And so, again, I think it's really interesting for us, was really serious for us to go, God, what are you calling me to? And what I think he's calling us to is a discomfort of having to wrestle through the issues of other people. So
that's good. So we don't have to land this plane. We can talk about this all day long.
Come on.
So in some closing thoughts, I want to read, some things from just a closing thought from Frederick Douglass, still from The Christianity of the Land versus the Christianity of Christ, for those who haven't heard it. It's a good read. So he also says, we see the thief preaching against theft.
Yeah.
Right. And his brother was good. He said, we see the thief preaching against theft. He's talking about the pastors of the day.
Yeah.
And the adulterer against adultery. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support the gospel, and babies sold to purchase Bibles for the poor heathen, for the glory of God and the good of souls. He has that in italics.
Yeah.
The enslaved auctioneer's bell and the church bell going bell chime in with each other. And the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master. Revivals of religion and revivals of the slave trade go hand in hand together.
Wow.
Don't have time to read the rest of it, but just the last closing thought. He says the Christianity of America is a Christianity of whose voluntaries, meaning whose virtues, it may be truly said, as it was of the ancient scribes and Pharisees.
Wow.
They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be born, and lay them on man's shoulders, but like you said, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Now here's a man who, you mentioned Frederick Douglass, he's an abolitionist, he's done great things, he started a bank, he had his own newspaper, he helped inform Lincoln when it came to things of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That's one side, and that's a great side. He had a great piece called "What to the Negroes the 4th of July." But rarely do we talk about this theological side. This man rooted himself in the same scriptures that were used to oppress and beat a lot of his loved ones to a pulp, as he would say in his book, to where their backs would run red like the river. And so all I'm saying, his need, to answer the question, Frederick Douglass, there's a need because in his story, you not only see a guy who was a proponent of social change because of Christ. This was a guy who maintained his faith under an oppression regime with people who misused the scriptures. But still he came out and theologically wrote these pieces that pointed people to Christ and delineated of, hey, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He's a message of hope. In my head, I go, why is he not in all seminaries? I know the certain ones that he's in, those who are particularly surrounding Black antiquity. But when we talk about progressive evangelicalism, there's no reason why he's not a mainstay right now. In evangelical seminaries. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. What are your closing thoughts, BJ?
So just in closing, I think that God is used. We believe in the doctrine of total depravity, and we believe that you can be depraved and it has impact. And sometimes we believe that there's certain things that will cause devastating impact. And what I would say, something that is devastating, is for us to separate how we live, how we engage the social environments from what we preach and what we talk about. And it's damaging. We saw the same thing in the 16th century in the Reformation, where they burned people alive under proclamation, and even struggled with the idea of whether or not the book of James was an actual book of the Bible, should be included in the canon scripture. And it's because God is calling your life into unison. He is not trying to divide your life from proclamation and behavior. So I would just say, as we wrestle with that, let's wrestle well with who we are, what we do, and let's stop just considering our attitudes, and let's look at our social environment. The way we live today is the outcome of what's happened in the past, and you or I are responsible not to fix the mistakes of people from the past, but to live in a way that restores what God intends, and He intends all people to have dignity, all people to have justice, all people to experience mercy. And that has to be our concern. That is no longer just a social gospel.
That's good. That's good. In closing on that point, and no longer making it a social gospel or theological proclamation of the gospel, it's this term of solidarity. And solidarity essentially means when you see me, you see another. And I believe for too long, we have stood on separate sides, camps of the theological gospel side and camps of the social gospel side. And we have yet to see, I would say, a true first in America from the evangelical church to where we stand in solidarity and say, you know what, my burden is going to be your burden, right? I'm going to wrestle to understand your methodology, even though I don't understand it. I'm going to wrestle in humility, right? Not in the arrogance and condescension. And so our hope in these talks and talks to come is a message of hope and solidarity, to say, like, hey, when we look at the flaws of, whether it's, a Whitfield or Edwards or a King, or even, reading today about the Haitian Revolution, to where they revolted and they won, but at the same time, they went so far to say, and if you are of French descent, we're going to kill you, right? That's not good. But we look at all those things to say, you know what, God doesn't use perfect people to bring about movements, right? He uses people. He uses clay. And unless we stand in solidarity, we're going to see a glass ceiling of what we can do in our lifetime. That's our time. I appreciate y'all chime it in. Feel free to post comments, ask us questions, tweet us. BJ at BJ116, myself at Red Rev. You're gonna catch us, Lord willing. Next week I'm gonna be in ATL, so we might do an impromptu.
Come on.
You know what I'm saying? Well, we sitting side by side. You see what I'm saying? You never know, right?
Yeah.
But, appreciate y'all. I love y'all.
All right.